This is actually a presentation I started as an article for an IEEE magazine. I think it was in 2013 when the first sort of popular wrist technologies were getting going. And I've updated it a fair bit. So there's 65 slides. Most of them have pictures. And it'll go into the 21st century, I confess. But let's see what we can walk through and learn about. And I don't doubt that a number of you will have a lot more details and technical precision than I can offer. So here's the state of smart watches as opposed to smartphones in 21. They retail at the bottom end from a variety of Chinese firms for under $30, with styles rather similar to what you see from some of the mainline companies. And as usual, Apple is not the early entrant, the cutting edge. They let others set up and develop a market, and then they put their designers and technical staff together to work really hard on making something that has excellent form, fit, and function and fits their brand. So their first watch was in 2015, the so-called Series 0, because it didn't actually have a number after it. And they continued it, I think, for about 2 years. It doesn't get updates anymore. They do still work. They still have a number of apps you can enjoy, like that tiny game of Pong. But they then pulled out before returning with a vengeance, several years later. This is when I started my piece the last time was 2013. And the actual story of the sort of wrist electronics is just like looking at smartphones. It's like looking at personal computers. It's like looking at radios. All the different entrants are trying to find a particular angle for what rapidly becomes a commodity. Everybody can use the same electronic components. You can hire your designer, but what is the killer feature or service that you can provide that nobody else has? So LG, formerly we know through, I think it's Zenith was bought up by them. I think there are probably others that do television on the wrist still, but they were the last or the notable ones to do a color video screen in 2009. And then we're just going to walk back here. Here's a great sales. It's 56 degrees and partly sunny in Seattle. Not the most appealing sales point. But this was one of the few watches that actually used FM transmission. So many of the others are Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. They're using electromagnetic waves. They're in the spectrum. The FCC has to approve them for whichever category of the spectrum they're playing in. But Microsoft made an error with this spot technology, which they applied to refrigerators and coffee makers. This is the early notion of the networked house and kitchen, where you could, tell your coffee to start brewing before you got home or before you got downstairs. So this they tied in with, the Microsoft Garden or Universe was Microsoft Network. You could use Messenger on it. You got these 12 FM radio channels. And they managed to license this out to a variety of other companies beyond Suunto. And again, it didn't go over that well because others were moving into the other streaming technologies. And if we keep going back, IBM Labs still retains pride of place, or it claims it for being the first to introduce Linux as the operating system, or the basis for the operating system that I think Android is based on now. You can see they have one of these little stem switches that Apple adapted later. There's a fingerprint sensor, and they've got the microphone and speaker and a little liquid crystal display. And Samsung predated them. Again, you're sort of watching Moore's law in reverse, and that's really what happens here. Is you have watches, you have radios, you have video, you have telephones, you have various games, and it's like, which features do you want to cram onto your chipset, for your processors that you think are most advantageous? And so Samsung was here with this, relatively large honking antenna, because we're also going back. This might have been 2G as opposed to 3G. I mean, every time you raise the spectrum of transmission, you're shrinking the size of the antennas. And then there's the fellow nobody pays attention to, I think mostly because he's Canadian. He's a professor at the University of Toronto who did Linux on a color video screen, LCD screen, in 1998. Being a university professor, he was not, he knew he's not a business person, but he and presumably the university were trying to license his patents. He had a variety of patents on compressing all of this features into that wrist bound technology. And then you go back and you get to 1994 when Microsoft, in line with Windows 95, you may recall, they had an offer that you could buy this Datalink 150 with a Windows 95 coupon that you got with your box for the operating system and so forth. And they cross-licensed with Timex, and it exchanged some data with your computer by a technique. I don't understand it by reading, but you actually showed it to the cathode ray screen, cathode ray tube. It didn't work with flat panels, and it bounced an infrared signal off the screen and somehow got data bounced back to linked to the watch. And it's got an Indiglo feature there as Microsoft provides, and you can go back to previous screens. And I think these still work, but you do need a CRT monitor for it to operate. So we get to kind of a break point here, the beginnings of all these data transfer technologies as opposed to broadcast technologies with the Dick Tracy movie in 1990 with Warren Beatty, and there he is handling a watch. I actually went to see this movie, and I have no memory of the watch, and maybe somebody else can share some warm and fuzzy thoughts. As I recall, it wasn't that good a movie.
A lot of singing.
I'm sorry?
A lot of singing.
A lot of singing. Oh, it was a musical because I had Madonna in it, right?
Yes, right.
Yes. I think I saw it at the Union Square movie theater, or Union Station movie theaters in Washington, beginning of grad school. So let's go from 1990 back to the beginning of the century, to the first person to promote the notion of a portable radio. It was Nikola Tesla, in line with his well-intended but fantastic ideas for wireless power transmission as well as wireless communications. The famous Warden Cliff, which the museum and science center are continuing to be developed on Long Island. But it was his notion, along with a great many others, after his great successes with AC polyphase power transmission and generation, that he never published anything. He even never actually got a successful public demonstration of almost anything after 1898 in Colorado Springs. But there he was saying this cheap and simple, and you could get, it'd be like a beeper almost, that you could get these messages from his giant globe-girdling tower. And just as a matter of comparison here, this was kind of the state of the art for people listening to him in the interviews, we may think that broadcast media, digital media, social media, that we've got so much more information than anybody had in an age of print. And all I can say is the more you look into resources like Google Books or the Hathi Trust or the Library of Congress, the various digitally scanned archives that colleges, universities, history institutions are putting up online, individuals, worldradiohistory.com, that David Gleason just keeps adding new stuff. You should bookmark that site and check in every couple of days, because it really is amazing. But what you learn from there was a ton of information, not just the technical information between engineers and between physicists or chemists or whatever, but between those and the people in the middle, like Hugo Gernsback, who's translating this, the sophisticated with all the equations into what could you hack or do it yourself at home or in your bench or basement or garage. And then there's the popular press. The media is always looking for a way to capture eyeballs or capture ears. And so they're always looking for a good story, and what can you find? So here is the example of the Marconi station at Poole, which I believe is the Isle of Wight, where the royal family stayed over the summers. And just to show you the size of a radio transceiver, both sending and receiving there with the batteries on underneath the table. So we progress ahead now to this notion of portability and getting things on the wrist. And the First World War, wars are often considered a time legitimately of significant accelerations or sharp revolutions, socially, politically, technologically. And in this case, it was this notion of military officers who are trying to time offensives, charges out of the trenches across no man's land after artillery barrages. They needed very good timing, and having a pocket watch that was jingling and jangling on your chest or in your coat was not very stable. But if you could strap a watch onto your wrist and then put a little bit of radium in it, you could be a little better in coordinating your attacks and making sure your people didn't get killed. And this was really the beginning over the course of the 1920s into the 1930s, where people increasingly, it was a generational change. Older people stayed with their gold chains and pocket watches, and younger people just began to wear the more convenient, all I have to do is stretch out my wrist or my arm and see what time it is, as opposed to fumbling around in my coat pockets. So it's 1922. RCA's been in business for 3 years, and here's the general manager in the midst of the 1922 radio boom, and he's got all sorts of good ideas. He was one of the people involved in making sure they could broadcast the Dempsey-Carpentier fight in July of 1921, not just to the 100,000 people in Jersey City at Boyle's 30 Acres, but to about 300,000 people listening between Maine and Ohio. And it's this radio craze, this radio catalog, Radio Enters the Home, is about 150 pages. You've got this notion of portable radios where somebody wants to get out of, his man cave. There he is. There is no loneliness where there is a radiola. So it's like, why go hiking if you can bring a radio, hump the radio with you along with your cast iron frying pan there. So Sarnoff, in August of 1922, when he should be on vacation, writes a lengthy 4-page memo or letter to Alfred Goldsmith, who is a professor of electrical engineering at City College of New York. And on the side, he was also RCA's research director. He was also one of the three founders of the Institute of Radio Engineers, one of the ancestors of IEEE, and an officer who had known Sarnoff since Sarnoff had become secretary of IRE in 1914. So Sarnoff is going to ask him, we're doing really well with these radios for the home. That's kind of the second stage of radio wireless transmission. The first stage was business to business, large industrial alternators and high power transmitters. The second stage is shrinking all of this for the receiver to get it into the household and let families and people use it. But the third stage that he foresaw and that he would pursue for the rest of his career was portability. How do we get this wireless communications onto the person, as opposed to these great big radios that a couple of Goldsmith's assistants are following? So part of his request here is, here's the third stage of radio. Now comes into view whether the individual, whether he be inside or outside of a fixed place. And what Sarnoff has been tracking is the increased research and publicity about the shorter waves, 200 meters and down, and how could we take advantage of these to fire up these radio telephone. They still have to say that it's a radio phone, not just a radio transmitter. And this would be from the brand new Aeolian Hall radio station. That's a colorized illustration by the very good fellow running the Radio Historian website. And there's Armstrong cavorting on top of the broadcast tower in 1923, quite happy that he's gotten a couple of $100,000 for the super regeneration patent that Sarnoff actually thought would be useful for this particular application. So he can see it, every 15 minutes, it's going to send out a time check, the baseball scores, stock, headlines and news, just like you see on a ticker tape, weather reports, railroad, or flight schedules. And then he has a whole bunch about police, security, and safety and criminality, rather impressively. So he concludes with the radio-let, which is the way he's described it. We're going to put radio and jewelry together in a way that well predates Steve Jobs and John Ivey at Apple, is to, get this out there for the general public and elites, and when can I have my first sample? So this is where, the high end of the market for radio-lets was going to be pretty damn fancy, and the antenna would go around as part of the necklace. So Goldsmith he takes, I think it's 5 weeks to reply. He's already busy trying to coordinate the production of RCA's radios from Westinghouse and General Electric, and testing improved loudspeakers and whatever they're doing with the vacuum tubes. And he writes back and says, well, we might be able to do this pretty quickly if you expanded the radio staff and invested some more money in this. But let me put Arthur Van Dyke, this new electrical engineer who came out of the Navy, where he'd been working on a battleship during World War I, and put him to work reviewing your proposal. And so this is a page of Van Dyke's review, one of the pages of eight issues that he can already see, beside a bunch of other general runs. This is September 6th. So it's transmission and absorption of short waves, 50 meters and less. Is this going to work inside New York City, much less subways? Using a crystal detector instead of vacuum tubes, sort of an unconscious anticipation of transistorization. The battery possibilities, both dry and storage, is a big issue in reducing the size of batteries. That's a chief problem. And tube possibilities, they're going to have to be made a lot smaller than the present peanut form. The headphones, we've got to make them smaller and lighter. The antenna, you'd have to use the body as an untuned pickup, and maybe short straight wires as antennas in clothing or ribbons or something, tuned and untuned, and then wired and wireless assistance, somehow adding antennas maybe in the walls of the subways and steel buildings. And then selectivity, it's how do we going to make sure we aren't drifting so badly. So it took 17 to 18 years for RCA's technical staff at RCA Victor, what became RCA Victor, to cram everything into a personal radio, the battery-powered 10, that you could carry around with you in a very large trench coat pocket for $25. But the marketing of it was much more successful than a number of the marketers predicted. They thought nobody's really going to want this. They ended up selling about 200 or 225,000 of these at $25 a pop. So it was a very nice deal, and it showed that, yes, you definitely could have wearable or walkable, portable, personal electronics. Now, I'm skipping over. I'm assuming there's probably a fair amount of other activities, but it's going to be dealing with all of those devices and broadcast standards and components as to who else is dealing with trying to miniaturize and make portable radio receivers, or in the case of Al Gross here, W8PAL, into a transceiver. And he had gotten the radio bug, I think, at the age of 10. He was born in 1918. By 1930, he was applying for his license. Very industrious, very productive. And it was the ham radio people that he was connected with who, learning about his interest in making this sort of transceiver, got him in touch with the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, and they put him to work on making this UHF transceiver for the Joan Eleanor spy network. This was a ground-to-air for various spies being dropped behind Nazi lines in France, in the Netherlands, Belgium, before the invasion of Normandy in 1944, and they're arranging for pickups and drop-offs and rescue missions or extraction missions and so forth. At the same time, Motorola, there's a fellow whose name I'm blanking on at the moment, who is trying to develop what becomes known as the walkie-talkie, and FDR discovers that the Secret Service is apparently kind of reluctantly experimenting with this during the campaign of 1940, in the fall of 1940, and says, get to work on this and start investing in this. So the President of the United States can see there is a considerable utility to these portable transceivers, which Motorola made a great many of and then marketed the heck out of after World War II and during the war. They couldn't make too many consumer products, so they and all the other radio entertainment companies touted what they were doing during the war was also going to help after the war. So the war comes to an end in the fall of 1945. Japan signs in September, and companies begin to gear up for the returning servicemen, begin to make these smaller radios with the miniature tubes that have been developed and refined, these mass production facilities. And here we are with Chester Gould and Al Gross and Cleto Brunetti and the issue of the watch. So lots of people assume that Gould, visited Al Gross and in Cleveland and Ohio between his trips from Chicago, where he worked for the Chicago Tribune, which syndicated his comic strip, and New York, for various other activities. But Gould, in interviews, never said anything about Al Gross, and apparently I'm willing to be corrected if somebody can point me to a confirmation that Al Gross will say that he gave Gould a tour, because at this time Gross is working on a citizens band radio, not miniaturized. That's going to come later, as you're going to see in a few minutes. So he's not really working on miniature at this time. But on the other hand, the National Bureau of Standards, under this fellow Cleto Brunetti, has been working with his staff in Washington and with Western Electric and RCA and a variety of other electronics manufacturers on how do we make more stable, durable electronics on printed circuit boards, miniaturizing tubes, miniaturizing resistors, getting all these components down. Because the military, obviously during wartime, is really interested in mil-spec equipment that is much more durable than you need in a civilian style. So when Gould debuts Dick Tracy's wristwatch radio, it's late January, third week of January in 1946. As he explains, you can broadcast it through the set. It's a relay system. Throws out there it's got the tiny tubes that Cleto Brunetti will announce as literally the size of a grain of a pretty fat piece of rice. A battery mentioned in passing, the microphone and the speaker, and you can press the button and it will switch. And then there's the aerial, which does have to run up the arm because we are still dealing with high frequency or VHF. So that was an episode that went on for a week or two involving a murder mystery and the top secret invention of Diet Smith's Brilliant Smith son, his son, Brilliant Smith. And in the next couple of years, Brunetti is, promoting. He's considered a very good promoter. It's interesting to look at people recounting around him, found him, apparently they didn't respect him much technically, but I tend to look at what the NBS is doing and saying, they're getting some good stuff done. You may not like the way he touted it, but he, did a very good job. So there's the Dick Tracy radio may come true. When they interview Brunetti and the issue of printed circuits. And in 1947, they're releasing articles by Hugo Gernsback is interviewing Brunetti and writing. He's reflecting on the fact that he knows Sarnoff. He and Sarnoff go back to the 1900s together. And now Gernsback is saying, well, we can do a 5-tube All-American 5 superhet watch side with these tubes, and this could fit. And sure enough, there is, Brunetti through Popular Science showing off, what they've done. They fit it on the wrist. It's a little bigger than a wristwatch, but they're getting there. Now, part of the story here is that Brunetti was apparently inspired in part to do the wristwatch at least as much by Harry Truman as he was by, Chester Gould and miniaturization. It was Harry Truman being the president of the United States. You're working for the NBS and the government. You'd like to get, your budget protected. So you send gifts to the White House. Now, unfortunately, I could not find a photograph of the radio wrist receiver that Brunetti sent to the White House. He sent a box of 5 of them where you could use them on the grounds of the White House, indoors or out, and Truman could basically, it was a one-way. He got the transmitter with a microphone, and others would wear the receivers so that when the president wanted to see somebody or talk to somebody, he'd get them immediately. So instead, you get the picture of the little homeless dog that Harry Truman got for Christmas 1947 as well, which he passed on to somebody in his cabinet, and and never saw again. But why a watch for Harry Truman? Well, the story behind this is that Harry Truman loved watches. He loved, we consider him the simple plain man from Missouri, but his one indulgence was some very nice chronometers, very nice wristwatches, foreign and domestic, and this is a selection of the ones that are known that he wore and owned. So you've got this all happening in 1947. We talk about Harry Truman's getting a miniature vacuum tube wrist radio transmitter receiver on Christmas Day, 1947. December 24th, on Christmas Eve, Bardeen and Bratton are demonstrating again and finally confirming the transistor effect at Bell Labs in northern New Jersey. So there's a rather fascinating irony here that you're watching this miniaturization process for vacuum tube electronics all through 1947 and even here into 48 because AT&T and Bell Labs don't announce the transistor until June. But here is Dorothy S. Dowling, one of the employees at the National Bureau of Standards, posing on Gernsback's magazine. And you can see it's the Brunetti wristwatch transmitter. And we can look forward to even smaller ones going forward. So one of the sticking points here is, okay, what's up with the battery life on these? And it turns out that various people have been paying attention to atomic energy. Lots of people are looking at all sorts of different isotopes and what you could do with them in small form. And here is General Sarnoff saying this may make possible the wristwatch radio receivers and television sets that may be carried in the pocket like a camera. And when that day comes, you're going to have pocket-sized radio phones that communicate with home and office no matter where they are. So again, this is a theme that Sarnoff has carried since 1922 and is pushing forward. Now, in the next paragraph, he's the first to say, this is not just around the corner. This is down the road, but we can see it happening. So in the meantime, here is Al Gross's contribution, which was donated to Virginia Tech. I'm not quite certain. I've forgotten what the story is behind why VT got this instead of Case Western, but they have the website with some of this material. Here's his wrist radio, at least the loudspeaker, if not the transceiver. And in 1948, like I said, Bell Labs announced the transistor in June, and by the end of the summer, RCA Labs, Wendell Carlson and Lloyd Barton, Barton being the master of RCA's transistor radio research in the late 40s, worked out, managed to get, here's the general's personal radio, the vest pocket receiver, using these 5 transistors or the 3 electrode crystals that they're making in Harrison, New Jersey. And it could use an earphone, the hearing aid type earphone. So next year, Gross comes out with his portable civilian transceiver. He's gotten, one manufacturer has got FCC approval on the 465 megacycle band. We can see how far up the spectrum they're running from the 25 to 50 megacycles that Sarnoff was looking at for shortwave in the early 20s. And this is about a quarter the size of Motorola's walkie-talkie after 2 years of research. So that's talking from 1947 to 1949, using those printed silver on ceramic, the printed circuit boards, and the sub-miniature tubes that Brunetti had been spearheading at the NBS. So there's one of the transceivers at Virginia Tech, pretty small vacuum tubes, got your capacitors, a few other components in there. And he then tried to get it into the New York hospitals, this notion that, all right, who really needs a personal radio receiver, that they can carry around with them? Who is going to pay for this? Because it's not going to be cheap initially. And the notion was the medical market. And so doctors would like to be paged and contacted or contact people back and forth. And unfortunately, he got a demo at one hospital in New York City, but that's about as far as he went. And then this is a Pathé radio or Pathé newsreel that was never released. They shot it, they produced it, about a two-way wristwatch radio in 1952. Here it is with the notion again that doctors and nurses could use this to communicate with one another. And it turns out that Pathé was covering Western Electric's development, which is what the engineer on the lower left there is holding as well. And I don't have any information about what AT&T and Western Electric were considering with their transistorized wrist radio. This is as far as it went. They were trying to get into hospitals just like Gross, and nobody bid. So we get back to the battery, and in 1954, Sarnoff is very pleased to announce that RCA Laboratories in Princeton has been working with radioactive isotopes and has developed this battery. But Chester Gould is going to say, hey, we've been using an atom battery since January of 46. Now, if you'll recall the comic strip from back in 46, there was no explanation of what the battery was, but this is a bit of, I think, joking between the general at RCA and the very famous comic strip artist in the 50s. So there's all sorts of spin-offs. There's Dick Tracy movies in the 40s. There's a TV show in the 60s. There's the wrist receiver here that you can get, is sort of a very low quality walkie-talkie, and I'm looking forward to hearing from a number of you who had many happy hours out playing in the swamps and toxic waste dumps of New Jersey with your wrist radios. And by 1964, Gould has moved on. It's now there is a wrist television. It's still using a picture tube. He has not decided that there will be a flat panel not using a cathode ray tube. There is a camera lens. We don't know if he's been talking to the people at Westinghouse and RCA who have been experimenting with ways to make a solid-state camera. There's an atomic light. You've got the little radio tuning dial and the antenna. And this, echoes what Sarnoff, who is getting near the end of his active career, but in 1960-61, he and RCA touted the televisions of the 70s, the TVs of the future. He'd been asking for a display that you could hang on a wall since since his anniversary gifts in 1951. And this was the notion that, all right, you're going to make that flat panel display, you're going to cram it down, all this solid state integrated circuits. We're going to be able to have a radio, we're going to have a television, presumably a microphone, or maybe not. And this is going to provide you through communication satellites, which RCA is obviously involved in after Tyros, the new developments in lasers from 1960 onward, that you're going to be able to transmit immense amounts of data by light wave, and so communicate with anyone anywhere. And you're going to have these miniature receivers that you'll be able to talk via radio using those personal channels. And this is one of his predictions. His best predictions were in communications. The other ones we tend to ignore. But there he is, holding a looking saintly and paternalistic, with his hopeful for the future of personal communications and space for this purpose. So at the laboratories in Princeton, they've started with Dick Williams finding that you could modulate light through voltage-controlled liquid crystals in a fine, thin display between glass and conductors. And George Heilmeyer taking this up and driving a team to get to this, while Bernie Lechner tried to figure a way to do it as a television. So somewhere in between that, a couple of engineers were trying to figure out, okay, we've got the liquid crystal display. There's our flat display. One of the applications for these flat displays will be the wrist. So what do we need for transistors to power, hours, minutes, maybe seconds, but we can drop the seconds. We'll just do hours and minutes. And this is Stephen Hofstein's, one of his series of pages on counting the number of transistors. He starts out with about 960 MOSFETs, and then says we drop the seconds, we get this down to about 770 transistors. And these little cubes are sort of showing the ways of the logic that's going to be drawing on RCA's new complementary metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistors being produced at Somerville. And what they don't know yet is that over in Switzerland, the Swiss watch industry and the Swiss government and Swiss researchers are tracking the development of quartz-controlled analog watches and what you can do with electronics, and the need for a low power, low voltage CMOS circuit. CMOS is already uses very low power consumption, but if you can reduce the voltage, you're doing even better. So, and then here is Robert Lohmann, several months after Steve Hofstein in another part of the laboratories at Princeton at RCA, also doing those little cubes and working out the transistor counts to get that liquid crystal clock onto his wrist. They couldn't do it for the big press conference in 1968, but they were looking forward to it. And when RCA management largely dumped liquid crystals displays, a number of people struck out on their own. Louis Zanoni and Zoltan Kiss and Ben Gross, who's done a wonderful job with the book on the televisions of tomorrow, has covered this in some detail. But this was, Louis Zanoni was Heilmeyer's technician, very smart guy, recruited some other very smart guys, and they had to find out, how do we take that circuit board with all the power supply and the drivers on the left and fit that into that Optel model HS1, which Optel began selling in 1972 with its dynamic scattering LCD. So a real collector's item. If you see this at a flea market, anything by Optel is worth snapping up, and often enough the liquid crystals are still in very good shape. So more popularly, you get product placement. You're doing light-emitting diodes, because we're talking about electronics on a wrist, and so we're not talking television here. We just want the LED lighted, which you have to press the button to see what time it is. And then Seiko, which is working with the Swiss on their low-voltage CMOS circuits and licensing. 4 years later is doing the 0072 report with that plastic tape that I remember well as a kid myself. So Seiko then went one further and got the television, the tiny little TV. Does not recommend you try to watch this in a subway or between very tall buildings. You're still going to have this problem with reception. And you do need to carry in your pocket. It's not just on your wrist. There's always this sort of additional stuff. Now, we often forget that there were other applications for wrist-bound electronics, one of which was the Pac-Man Nelsonic game watch, right here. Another, to my mind, a real collector's item if you can find it new in box. They actually came in a variety of different boxes. You'll find in that handheldmuseum.com. A lot of good stuff if you're moving beyond radio. So Dick Tracy and is now being run by two fellows. Chester Gould has retired first from the artwork and then from the plotting. And Max Collins, who's the writer, and Dick Loker in 1986, they've decided to upgrade Dick to the computer. And it's not just a computer, but it's a cellular network computer that has access to the databases for firearms, for medical information, for fingerprint databases. And it's tied, the only person who can use it is the one whose heartbeat has been cued to it. And so it's heartbeat recognizable. And what's fascinating is that that's what, a number of these 1990s, even in the 1990s, a number of those watches that we saw at the beginning of this talk were able to detect heart rate. Not at the ability or the quality to be approved by the Food and Drug Commission or the federal government, but it was there. And so you had this in 2017. Is like, what are you really going to use wrist electronics for? Are you going to talk to your wrist to a tiny display and wonder where the microphone is, or is that going to stay in your hand or on a screen? I think it's still up for discussion. And so today there's all sorts of discussions. Who is getting government approval for EKGs, ECGs, atrial fibrillation, heart health. You're looking at an aging demographic of baby boomers, not just in the United States, but around the world. And everybody wants that heart health and potentially, those alerts that you don't want to wear around your neck, you're more comfortable wearing around your wrist. So we will conclude there. I'm open to lots of comments and questions. Don't guarantee that I can answer them. If you have some experiences involved in this, I encourage you to go to ethw.org. This is the multiple technical organizations, IEEE, mechanical engineers, civil engineers, chemical engineers, women in engineering, all combining to contribute historical information, documentation, and in this case, firsthand histories. If you don't get someone to record you in an interview as an oral history, you can always write down your own recollections of things you were involved in. So I will thank you very much at this point and take questions.
Alex, I have a question for you.
Yep.
A lot of people today are concerned about radiation from cell phones and such. And even Apple puts in their huge manual on the iPhone that you should keep the cell phone, a few centimeters away from your head. The watches, though, no one seems to be talking about that. And I was wondering if you had heard anything about that.
No, that's the first I've heard. I mean, I would say one of the things about the cell phones is the notion that, okay, you're talking this gigahertz radiation, it diffuses rather quickly, but when the cell phone is pressed up against your ear,
yeah.
How much of that radiation is actually penetrating bone and affecting your brain?
Right.
And that's the open question. So I think the watch issue of possibly affecting your wrist bones is presumably less concerning to people.
Gotcha. Especially though when you consider it's attached, right up against your skin.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's also shielded more effectively in the back of the phone.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Alex, this is John
Yes.
Stoll. If I can just expound a little bit on the cell phone and brain cancer thing.
Okay.
I saw an article on a BBC website many years ago.
Okay.
What it came down to is they looked at health records from Sweden, which has had socialized medicine for a very long period of time.
Right.
And the early cell phones actually had higher power than the more modern ones do. What they found is that the radiation was not enough to penetrate the bone structure. However, they found that very, very heavy users of phones, those who were on the phone, because they were running businesses or whatever, and they were using that, very, very heavily, they started to develop tumors of lymph nodes and softer tissue.
Okay.
So it's not brain cancer that, the early cell phones gave to people, but it did cause a slight increase, like I say, in soft tissue areas.
Right.
If I could respond to that for a minute, my wife actually passed away from a brain tumor. And she was a heavy early user of cell phones for her business. And the area where the tumor developed was in the area of that right side of her head where she would hold the phone. So, that's why I've always had a curiosity about this, because of personal issues.
Oh, okay. It's very curious because I remember reading a profile of a woman Ph.D. in microwave, electronic microwave physics, and I think it was a New York Times, weekly profile of somebody in STEM, and she was one of those people that did not believe that microwaves were dangerous. And it's always this issue of, statistical, people look at the statistics and you weigh that against a story like Bob's and you don't know what to think.
Hello?
Because power control has been applied to cell phones for the last 20 years. Before that, they basically blasted at full power.
Okay.
You really have to think about whether improvements have been made, whether it's ionizing radiation.
Right.
Look at more modern studies.
Well, this is Steve Miller. Back around the early 2000s, I think they were saying that cell phone users were using between 250 and 450 milliwatts. Does that sound right? Or is it microwatts? I forget.
Not
it
nowadays.
was a lot more than they get now. But in Sweden, they were looking also at little benign growths on the auditory nerve and neuromas. And I don't know what the clinical significance might be to you, but regulators, they look on any tumor as a tumor, whether it's benign or otherwise. And in Sweden, they seem to kind of find a high correspondence between, people who had been using these things for, I don't know, maybe up to 10 years, and the side of the head that they spoke from, held the phone on. And it's mostly Swedish studies, but I think a lot of people around New Jersey, people I knew at Rutgers who were involved in, public health, they were saying, oh, let's just be cautious and tell your kids, just text. And pretty much that's what's happening. They just text.
Right.
And it's just the distance is much further. And whether microwaves can do anything like that, and what frequencies and what modes and how many combinations of, modulating. Let me get my duck out of the way here. Modulating these signals come into it, that's going to be mystery for eons, I think. And yeah, there's all kinds of statistical analyses that can be applied that will show you anything you want to show.
I would just say avoid some of the early studies, look at more recent studies.
Right.
Well, it takes a long time for nervous system tissue tumors to develop.
Well, good. More recent studies should show more.
Well,
Why
it
not?
depends. It depends what the exposure was when. Retrospective studies are pretty difficult. And if you're worried, if you say, oh, let's just study what's happening right with devices now, you really got to think ahead about 30 years. Brain tumors are pretty slow growers, but once they go, it's awful.
Say, Alex.
Yes.
Regarding the Dick Tracy wrist radio, I would like to offer up a couple of displays of the Dick Tracy wrist radios.
Okay.
Now, I don't know if I have the full screen, but here's one of the boxes. If it shows up on the big screen, I don't know.
Oh, yes.
Excellent.
Why don't I have the full screen like you are appearing?
Well, you do. I see it.
To Seiko.
Yeah, I see you, Steve. So
If you set the speaker view, you will.
You do when you speak, Joe, but when somebody else talks, they get the screen right now.
So
So keep talking. Recite the alphabet backwards.
Well, I want to show you some radios as well, Dick Tracy radios, but I thought I'd show you the great graphics on this box here.
Yes.
Well, I'm talking, but I'm still not showing up. Okay, here we go.
We can see you. Very nice. Did you use this, Joe?
I haven't actually tried it, but I'm going to show them to you. You see that one right there? I'm going to show that to you.
No, I just wondered if you grew up with this.
Oh, no, I did not. I bought this from someone 25 years ago.
Okay.
Wow.
But now I'm going to show you the actual radios. There are two versions that I happen to have.
That's precision
Okay.
electronics.
Now, this one here, this strap, you see the battery here. Apparently, you put it on your wrist.
Yep.
And this is what it looks like.
Sure. Wow.
Wow.
Okay, now that's half of it. The other half is, well, why doesn't it? Oh, here's the other. This is the other half.
Okay.
Upside down.
No, that was right side up before. Now it's upside down.
Oh, now it's upside down.
Right.
Okay.
There you go.
So well, it doesn't stay on my wrist, but it's supposed to.
You need a thicker kid's wrist.
Now I'm going to show you another one.
Thanks
I
to
think
the
with
engineers at
3D
Bremco.
printing, we could equip the entire club with wrist radios.
Yeah.
Oh, now that's the power pack. Now, is that a light or a speaker?
Now this must be, I believe this is a speaker,
Okay.
right? And the connection, it's hard.
It's Bluetooth, right?
The connection right here.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
I think it's long in the tooth.
Beautiful.
Now I don't know if this is right side up or not.
Yeah,
but
no, you got it. Press to talk.
So that's one set there.
Yep.
Pretty cool, right? And
Show and tell, best kind.
yeah. Now this one here says it's good up to, what's it say? I can't even read it. Good up to half mile.
Right.
Whoa.
No way.
I'd like to know who actually tested that.
Now, see, it says it good up to 1/2 mile. You see it there?
Yeah.
Might be hilltop to hilltop.
Now, I'm stunned. We have, 50 plus people here, and I have yet to hear a voice saying, yeah, I had one of these when I was 10 years old.
Yeah.
I had the Remco Caravelle.
Okay.
More of a desktop unit.
Well, those are my 2 sets of Dick Tracy radios.
Very nice.
Alex, we have the opposite. At the museum, we have a couple of different brands of BP-10s. Apparently, there were something like 7 different manufacturers.
Yes.
RCA licensed.
Sure.
And we have a Gear smartphone watch.
Uh-huh.
Theoretically, an actual smartphone watch.
Yep.
And
yes, I remember Gear. There's multiple articles online doing retrospectives of landmarks in watch.
Right, and thanks. Well, anyway, thanks to Dr. Robert Forte, we have one to display in the museum.
Aha.
And we have various of some of the items that you described.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if anyone would like to come to the museum, please do.
Cobble together an exhibit.
Alex, what were the prices of some of the those?
If I may just jump in a second.
The 90s.
That wristwatch that I donated to the club was the second generation. The first generation was the Samsung. The Samsung, which I have the first one. The one I donated was the second one. But what was unique about these wrist radios is they were independent cell phones. In other words, all the other wrist radios tethered to your cell phone. But the one that you have and the one that I have are independent. I actually used that, and I used mine. I actually had a number for that, and I've tried it a few times, and it works fine. Uh-huh. So the one in the museum is really unique, and that's the second generation of the independent cell phone, wrist cell phone. It's really nice piece.
No, somebody was asking about prices, and I remember, I think it was that 1998, 99 Samsung was, I think, $700 or $800 when it was released. And that's, pre 2000 money. And then over successive years, you began to see it get down $600 and $400. And now, as we see, you can get something that apparently is some sort of, I don't know if it actually is a phone or it's just a smart watch. We have this real issue with terminology because so few people, to my mind, use smartphones as phones. They're computers and TV stations and video game platforms. It's calling them a smartphone is a misnomer.
Jack of all trades, right?
Yes, exactly. And nobody's come up with a term, just like these watches where, the fact that they actually tell time is like, yeah, I want it to give me an EKG and a brain function.
Some of those watches now no longer will tell time. They've actually issued some that have no clock feature. And there's also, I forget which, I don't think it's Apple, one of the iPad or, what do you call them? Tablet manufacturers has a commercial where there's a little girl reading, doing her homework on this, and her mother calls her and says, it's time to turn off that computer. And the little girl looks up puzzled and goes, "What's a computer?"
Right.
The Seiko watch that you showed, the LCD watch that had the James Bond thing with the ticker tape coming out, that was one of the early Seiko digital watches. They just put the little tape coming out of it.
Yeah.
And I bought that watch when I was working in high school. I was working for a jeweler at the time. It retailed for $150, and because I worked there, he gave it to me for like $75 or $80. Mm-hmm. So that's what it originally cost.
You still have it?
I still have it. Yes, I haven't put a battery in it, but I wouldn't be surprised if it still worked because it was pretty reliable.
Oh.
He also showed the Hamilton Pulsar, which is the first digital watch. Digital LCD or LEDs, and those are increasingly hard to find because nobody ever took the batteries out of them. So I've been looking for years to find one that actually works, and I actually gave up. And it's funny that I didn't even know this was the presentation, but yesterday I got in the mail an Armatron watch. It's a reproduction of the shape of that Hamilton watch, and they use segment LEDs as the it's much bigger, much more modern, but they styled it to look like that. So I just thought it was funny because I just got in the mail yesterday.
I seem to recall that the Pulsars went for a bit more money. I think they were either $300 or $450 when they came out.
I had one of those Hamilton watches, a ladies one.
And I had one of those Pulsars, but they came in solid gold, believe it or not, which I did not buy, which was a mistake. And really, and then I have a silver one, which I believe still works. Uses two LR44 batteries, but mine works. So Matt, I'll bring it in one of these days. I'll show you.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen one actually work very long. And when they started making the knockoff ones that Hamilton didn't make, those are even harder to stay working because they don't use like the standard crystal frequency. So most of them are all dead, and there's no modern crystal that matches it.
Well, here's my entry into this. I've got one of the Timexes here, and it still works. I use it. It's my alarm to wake up. To solve the issue.
You must be a light sleeper.
That's a very loud alarm. It's the loudest alarm. I can hear it all over the house. It's the loudest alarm around. And to solve the issue with the LCD display, what they did is they painted lines on the CRT and essentially a serial bit stream, kind of like RS-232. So to solve that, with an LCD, I made up a little driver on a 9-pin or a VGA connector. With
Only Neville.
Wow.
And it flashes the right codes to the watch. I haven't used it in a long time, though. But it still works. And the other thing, Alex, you might want to put this in the museum, one of the early Casio GPS watches. It's kind of interesting because it has a software bug that gets the day wrong. I don't know when that bug showed up, but it could have been one of the GPS epochs, which passed a number of years ago. So I'm not using this. If the museum wants it, I'll certainly donate it.
You may have found the only Y2K bug in existence there.
Exactly.
Right. Neville, what was the point of the transfer? Like, what data goes into the watch? Because that's what I was struggling. Is it just a calendar? Like, what would you put on the watch?
Okay, you had there's four or so. You can put appointments into it.
Okay.
It will essentially flash the display or something, or the alarm to get your attention on certain dates and times. And you could put like a 7-character message on it that it would show you. And it's got a chronometer and a couple other functions you could do with it, which frankly I haven't actually used in a long time. But you could put very short messages. And for a while I had the when you lose your credit card, what phone numbers do you call? I figured that would be useful to put in the thing.
Yeah, I've never heard of those watches, which is interesting because I spent most of my entire life dicking around with IT stuff, and I started out around the time that they were out. I'd never heard of them, never seen them.
There were
That's fascinating.
There's a Model 100 and a Model 150. This is actually a Model 150 in a 100 case, or maybe the other way around. It's a 100 in a 150 case, whatever. The original case dissolved, so I have rather acidic skin, which will remember a watch case rather shortly.
None of those things transmit at all, right?
No, it's one way.
Okay.
Hey, while we're on the subject of old technology, here's something that I still use. Anybody remember that?
Oh, no.
Go back.
Pilot.
Too close. Palm Pilot.
Palm Pilot.
Start talking.
Oh, yeah, Palm Pilot.
Tungsten Palm Pilot. And I actually still use it as an appointment holder and an alarm device for, for signaling my appointments and everything.
Marv, is it steam powered?
No.
Actually,
that's only about 15 years old, right, Marv?
No, it's more than that.
It's older than that.
Oh,
yeah. It's still.
I got one in 2000.
it still works, and it still has games, and you could play games on it, and you could actually you could download PDFs to it, and Microsoft Word, and you know, some other things to it. I never used it for that function. I never got that interested in
I
it.
think that I remember a doctor who had some kind of medical dictionary on it, or drug interaction, some kind of pharmacology.
Yeah, it's got
database.
little chip things you can, you know,
Yeah, they're pretty handy.
And this one still works pretty good. And the other thing is you could write on it, and you know, you can input data
Digitizer.
via a you know, a little scribe, which
yeah.
Graffiti.
Oh, those things are amazing.
Yeah, it was called. Yeah, you're right. It was called graffiti.
have.
That was their handwriting recognition.
Yeah, this is, in fact, I even have the, I don't know if you could, no, I guess you can't. Wait a minute. Here's the recognition stuff on the back. You couldn't just write it like you normally do. It had to be written in a special way, you know, in a special direction.
Yes, that's right. They had their own alphabet for the stylus.
Right.
Shorthand.
But while we're on the subject, Alex, and you're probably the one who knows about this, I'm looking at Popular Electronics from 1955, April 1955, and they're talking about things to come. And one of them is it's still largely experimental, is RCA's electronic light amplifier.
Yes.
Described as a new form of illumination, electronic light or cold light, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't depend on combustion, blah, blah, blah. But the kicker is RCA engineers hope to perfect by late next year a new type of video known as mural television.
Right.
In which the present TV picture tube will be replaced by a thin, flat screen that can be hung on the wall. Now, did RCA actually invent the flat screen TV? Because I don't remember them putting that in production.
That was one of David Sarnoff's 50th anniversary wishes in 1951. You know, he said, for 1956, on my 50th year of my career, I would like 3 gifts. And it was electronic refrigeration. It was color videotape, and this, you know, I want you to amplify light. And it was a very complicated process of using luminescence and phosphors and irradiating them, not like you would with lasers. And they ended up working on this for about 10 years. It had some advantages for X-rays or you know, amplifying. I guess it was amplifying X-rays, so you didn't have to give people such a dose of
they talk about that. Yeah, radar too.
Right, and then they got to a point where they, you know, it's like you had to find some way to matrix these, and a guy named John Reichman, who was their computer memory person, you know, worked out a ways with transfluxers, I think they were called, active matrix addressing of 1200 basically pixels to get you a minimal size image, you know, 30 by 40 bits. And Bernie Lechner worked on this in the late 50s. George Briggs, who was one of the engineers who actually wired all 1200 of those transfluxers to address each one of the luminescent pixels, just died. And I just discovered at worldradiohistory.com, I don't know where David Gleason got it, but it's like an 8-page booklet from RCA, I think it was Lancaster, was selling panel ray. So it wasn't television, but it was luminescent, electronically luminescent light panels in different colors. And it was supposed to be a whole new way of decorating and illuminating your house with these flat panels. And I don't know if any of you guys have paid attention to what they're doing with LEDs for the same thing. But Philips has been trying to do this with, programmable LED panels and lighting that gently changes color for mornings, evenings, midday, etc. And apparently RCA was doing a simpler version of that, over 50 years ago. It didn't last very long. You can find nothing on, you Google RCA panel ray, one word, and nothing comes up. I mean, there's a couple of newspaper.com references, literally a couple, and like 1962 or 63, and that's it. So the light amplifier, to get back to your question, Marv, that didn't work, but that's what the liquid crystal display was supposed to be, sort of a solution. And then when they found out that trying to active matrix address 1200 liquid crystal pixels, that means you have 1200 transistors on an integrated circuit. And in 1968-70, they didn't have 1200 transistors on an IC.
I'll be real quick. Well, here's something in the same article that seemed to have worked. It says, heralded as a major step into a new era of electronic photography is RCA's new TV tape recorder.
Yes.
Both color and black and white telecasts can now be recorded on tape. Right. And an unlimited number of copies made quickly and cheaply. Yes. So I didn't know that RCA developed the actual, the video recorder tape.
Well, for color. Those guys at Ampex, did the simple one, relatively simple one, which was black and white, and got the market on that. And because, Armstrong said we choose what it is, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. I want color on that videotape. And Harry Olson, who was the head of the audio laboratory, for unclear reasons, was put in charge of the project. And I think it was a 2-inch magnetic tape that, ran by at 40 miles an hour. I mean, it was extremely high speed. And you got, either 15 minutes of video or 5 minutes of video for an enormous, reel that looks like one of those 70 millimeter movie reels, if you've ever seen one of those. He was high and kludgy, and ultimately they cross-licensed with Ampex because they had color and Ampex had everything else. Yep. Yes, Harry?
That's what I was going to say. Ampex was in that business, at least for...
Right. James, you have your hand up over there. Is that?
I beg your pardon?
James Doran has a hand up.
I do, but I already spoke up. So
okay.
Thanks. I'll take it down. There you go.
Looks like they uploaded a brochure about panel ray to American history.
Yeah, it's now called World Radio History, and he's defaulted it. So if you still put in American Radio History, it goes to World Radio History.
It looks like they uploaded it like 5 days ago. There's a brochure about it.
Totally chuffed. Something I've never heard of in 25 years of looking at RCA.
That'd have been nice if it had a real picture in the brochure and not all the drawings.
It's very speculative. It's like
it looks like a light bright.
we have certain sizes, but we'll do things to custom. Talk to us. Anybody else?
Any other questions for Dr. Alex Magoun and his great presentation?
Yeah. Any pictures of some of your pictures?
I'm sorry?
Can we get images of any of parts of your talk?
Well, I assume I will be talking to Mr. Seiko about that and doing it like the last presentation. You'll notice I tried to put as many copyright protections on the Dick Tracy cartoons because when I first wrote this article, I went to the fair trouble of contacting Tribune Media and getting permission.
Dave and I once put something up on YouTube and they immediately took it down. So
right.
about that.
Well, this is up on YouTube. If the resolution is acceptable, or if you want to send me the full res stuff, we can put that up too, Alex.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right.
Super.
Anybody else have anything with Dr. Alex? Anyone
Very
else?
good. I hate to cut and run, but I've got another work obligation to finish that I was supposed to do yesterday.
All right, Dr. Alex, thanks so much.
Thank you all for listening and sitting in. Have a great night and a somewhat cooler weekend, but pleasanter weather all the time. And vaccinations for everybody.
All right, thank you as usual, Dr. Alex. A wonderful guy. Really appreciate it.